All right, we're going to start by introducing ourselves. My name is Matt Frazer from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, here representing them both as a band member and as an employee for the government. I've been working on this particular project since my employment started with the band, which is about 7 years now, and then I'll pass it over.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Herman. I work for the Chippewa National Forest. I've been working for the Forest Service for 2 years. Started my career in tribal land with the White Earth Tribal Land Office. Went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and had an opportunity to move over to the United States Forest Service, Chippewa National Forest, and I am the Tribal Relations Specialist on the forest.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dave Bismarck, and I am the land surveyor for the Land Department, Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I've started working for the Leech Lake Band 16 years ago, and I've watched a lot of this happen. I never got my hands into it, just done a survey part of it, but yeah.
So today, we wanted to start out with some unfortunate news. One of the pioneers on this project recently passed away as of last week. His name is Richard Robinson, and that's what you see here pictured. So I'd like to start out today's session by giving him a moment of silence. So if you will, please. Thank you. Rich was the longtime DRM director of the Division of Resource Management, where Dave and I both work. He was a great family man. He was monumental for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe tribe in many ways, and real great boss, father, overall good man. So, thank you for that. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and start. Yep, and so I'm going to give you a very shortened version of a story from Rich Robinson here, and kind of how this project started. Rich Robinson's great-grandfather had an allotment on the Leech Lake Reservation in a village called Bena, Minnesota. And apparently the story goes is that mobsters would come up there to kind of hide out. And he let it out to, they built a cabin on that said allotment. So they would congregate there, and his great-grandfather would go on to tell his son, which would be Rich's grandfather, about them staying there in that cabin. And apparently they had a lot of money and loot that they stored there in that cabin. And so Rich's grandpa was pretty bent on getting to that treasure someday and going looking for it. And his grandpa would tell Rich about that. And so time goes on, and he finally has the ability to go to that allotment and start looking around for that said treasure. And he gets to the allotment, and there's a Forest Service gate on the allotment. And they're wondering why. This is supposed to be, my dad's allotment. And so this is what kind of prompted the start of this, looking into it and finding out why that there's a Forest Service gate there now. And so that was one of the secretarial transfers that was taken. We're going to talk about them and what they are, but that really started this whole project, and that was, 50 some odd years ago, maybe even longer than that. Yeah. So Rich Robinson, this is his story, and that's why I shortened it up real just to the basics of it. But it's a really cool story, and he's told this story to us on the Leech Lake Band many times, and I wanted to share that with you here today.
So the quote and the photo, sorry, that was loud. The photo that you see is Rich Robinson, and the quote is from a New York Times story at 2004, 2005, early 2000s. And that's Rich's quote about his grandfather. And Rich's grandfather, of course, said, I didn't sign anything, didn't receive any money, and my land is gone. So with that, we'll kind of dig into the secretarial transfers. So the secretarial transfers and kind of our efforts here today are a result of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Reservation Restoration Act, or Public Law 116, and I'm sorry, I have a typo, it is 255. So if you're writing that down, and I'll try to correct it for the version that goes out, it is Public Law 116, 255, signed into law on December 23rd, 2019. And it is a trust-to-trust land transfer, meaning that the land is already held in trust for the Forest Service, and when the transfer is complete, will immediately go into trust for the Leech Lake Band as tribal trust parcels. No applications necessary. It's just a transfer of trust land.
I just wanted to kind of point out, so this is our ownership map here on the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And as you can see, we're very checkerboarded across the tribe here. The red and the blue and the orange, that's our current ownership, with the blue being the allotments. And in the kind of light green is the Forest Service land. So you can see there the major land ownership within the reservation. And our borders cross, here's the Chippewa National Forest border in the green, ours is the red. So we share a pretty unique relationship in that matter.
Facts about the Chippewa National Forest. The forest was established as a Minnesota forest reserve, and then became a national forest in 1908. The forest we manage on the Chippewa, close to 675,000 acres. Interestingly, 44% of the forest lies within the Leech Lake Reservation, but 90% of the reservation lies within the forest. It presented with those numbers the first time, it was kind of hard for me to wrap my head around it, but suffice to say that the forest and the Leech Lake Band are enjoying a successful co-stewardship relationship on those acres that we share. We have 1,300 lakes and ponds on the forest, 925 miles of rivers, 440,000 wetland acres, 25 watersheds. 13% of all of the surface water in the National Forest System is on the Chippewa National Forest. And 3 of Minnesota's 10 largest lakes are on the forest.
Okay, so, what are the secretarial transfers? So during the 40s and 50s, there were sales of these allotments. The sales during the secretarial transfer process, when they were sent out to these allottees, some were sold legally, but after further looking into the documentation, some were deemed illegal, and that's what we're looking at today here, the secretarial transfers. Some of the reasons why they were determined illegal was that there was a no response. Another reason why it was deemed illegal was because the tribal members of the allotments were deemed incompetent. Now, whose version of incompetent was that? Who's to say? And incompetent could have been that they simply don't speak English. So it obviously a very wrongdoing, and that's why it was deemed illegal in, I believe, 1980 in a case, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more down the road. And so over 17,000 acres throughout the reservation were illegally taken in that manner.
So a little bit more about that. As is still the practice today, if the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs wants to take action, approve an encumbrance, or even a sale of trust land, it needs to get consent from a sliding scale of majority of heirs, basically. At the time, and these transfers occurred in the 40s and early 50s, but at the time they needed 51% consent. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs sent letters out to the landowners. It gave them 10 days to respond. And in this case, it was found that a no response, they interpreted as a yes, the Bureau did. Needs to be noted that the land was appraised and the Forest Service paid for these lands that it received from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So going back to Rich Robinson's statement and what he learned from his grandfather, is that the grandfather did not receive money, or stated that he did not receive money for his portion of that land. Things were clearly amiss. But, and just to clarify something, these sales were, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was advised to stop these sales, that they could not continue with these sales in the late 50s. So, not going to read this, but just in the interest of kind of providing some background, and in the hope that this presentation and this information is shared out with folks that are at the conference. This talks more about those secretarial order transfers And then it talks about a 1981 lawsuit by a Leech Lake Band member who did not consent to the sale of her interest in Leech Lake land to the Forest Service. And so that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was beyond the 12-year statute of limitations under the Quiet Title Act, but it did say that there was merit, right, and that these transfers were illegal, and further speculated that this would be resolved through legislation, and indeed it was, with the passing of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Reservation Restoration Act. So some background there, citations that that can be referred to, and there's even, I referred to the 10-day response time in the letters that landowners received, and the direct language from the letter that says, if no reply is received from you within 10 days, it's assumed that you have no objection to this sale. This is a transfer document. And so didn't show the whole document, but just wanted to highlight this particular allotment on the Leech Lake Reservation, and who the original allottee was, that allotee's date of death, and that 2 of the landowners were deemed incompetent.
And so this is a timeline. I'm sure a lot of you know what happened in the past here, but we kind of wanted to highlight when this occurred from 1948 to 1959, which was during the termination era of federal Indian policy. And ironically, this was the same time that the Line 1 pipeline came through Leech Lake. And we're adamantly opposed to the pipeline. We're actually having Line 3 removed from Leech Lake currently. And we just kind of wanted to show you what happened right when these illegal sales were happening and how it lines up with this infrastructure coming through.
Right, so I'll just, as many of you I'm sure know, our fractionated ownership on allotted trust land and the requirement of the Bureau to receive consent today is difficult and oftentimes impossible. In the 1940s, 1950s, probably weren't hundreds of owners on these Leech Lake allotments as there are now, but still a task, right, to reach out to people and get consent. And so I think the timing of this is the pipeline and the secretarial order transfers. If you're looking at it through that lens, sale of these allotments kind of made sense, right? At least from the Department of Interior's standpoint, because it made the very difficult task of finding owners and getting consent easier. Just wanted to comment on that. Okay, so the act was passed, right? It was passed on December 23rd, 2019. And so what were the next actions? So the act says that the USDA, United States Forest Service, had 180 days to respond to the Secretary of Agriculture. The Secretary of Agriculture will submit to Congress a plan of survey to establish the boundaries of the federal land. And so we accomplished that. We worked with the band, the Forest Service, worked with the band, drafted the plan of survey, and the plan of survey really was our work plan. How are we going to accomplish this? And it had to do, and we'll move into this in a couple of slides, but it really had to do with how are we going to identify land? How are we going to identify encumbrances? Whose records are we going to use? What if we need to partition a parcel? How are we going to look at that? Who's going to keep the records? How are we going to transfer the records? So a very big kind of comprehensive document that we worked collaboratively with the Leech Lake Band to make sure that we were doing the right thing, the Chippewa National Forest, and that the transfer made sense, that it targeted and identified and emphasized areas of concern for the band and kind of what our plan was going forward under the act. So we accomplished that, right, 180 days after the act was passed. And we are working on the next step. And the next step and the final step is that we deliver to Congress a map and legal descriptions of the transfer parcels. And by the way, the act specifies that we will transfer, the Forest Service will transfer approximately 11,760 acres of Forest Service land to the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And so we are 96% complete with verification of legal descriptions and having a map that is sufficient for Congress.
And so, me being the GIS guy, I want to talk about the map again. What you're looking at right now on the screen is the original identified secretarial transfer parcels. And I'll kind of point out why that's important in a little bit here. But the lines within the reservation boundaries, there's 4 different counties there. In the northwest, that box part is Beltrami County, and up to the northeast is Itasca County. The large southern portion is Cass County, and there's a little sliver there on the west side of the reservation that's Hubbard County. The 11,760 acres that Christine just mentioned are going to be all contained within Cass County to the south there. And we hope to continue working to get the Itasca and Beltrami. There were no secretarial transfers in Hubbard County. So this is where we begin to work. The original secretarial transfers were there for us to look at. During the process, the Chippewa National Forest had presented us with an alternative to the same number of acres, but different parcels. The alternative they highlighted was to add acreage around our already existing communities, which we looked at, and thought it seemed like a good idea, but let's kind of dive into it a little bit more. And so we at the tribe were kind of reviewing it, And at that time, our DRM director, were looking at this alternative, and he comes in one day, and he kind of had this vision as he was driving into work, and he kind of said to us, some of them places where our villages are right now are where we were told to live, forced to live. Since they offered us an alternative, why don't we choose where we want the land and start looking at other parcels and send them an alternative? And, light bulb above the head. And so we get to work on finding land, Chippewa National Forest land within that boundary, looking at things like, well, obviously a lot of lakeshore. We don't have a lot of lakeshore ownership. Places where we can develop. We have a housing shortage on Leech Lake. As you saw on our ownership map previously, we don't have a lot of land. So we had thoughts of cultural areas, cultural access, heritage areas where we thought people would want to live, economic development. Those were all kind of ideas as we are looking at depicting these parcels. Another cool story as we're picking these parcels is one of our employees was sitting in with us, and he was telling us that I think it was his grandma. His grandma was born on one of these. Did you want to talk about that at all? Yeah. I'll let Dave tell us.
Yep.
So, kind of what we're kind of saying here is we had a really big victory in getting this land back in the first place. And then with all the secretarial transfers that were coming back that was stolen, all these parcels were kind of checkerboarded all over the place. And there was a lot of them that are actually unusable. They were wetlands and stuff like that. So the Chippewa National Forest come back and says, okay, instead of making these checkerboarded, let's consolidate, because you're going to be checkerboarded and we at the same time are going to be checkerboarded. So we'll give you an alternative. Instead of all the checkerboarded land transfers, secretarial transfers, we'll consolidate and consolidate. So you have your land together, we have our land together, and that's what they threw on the table for us. And Matt was saying, that our director was thinking about, and on top of that victory of getting all of our land back in the first place, we had another victory on top of that where we wiped all of that stuff off the table and we said, this is what we want. This is the land that we want. Instead of having something offered to us, we said, this is the land that we want. And Matt was saying that some of the land that we chose, there was a parcel of land next to a rice bed that one of our employees, his grandma was actually born there back in the day. So some of these lands that we chose were stuff like that. And a lot of land that was riverfront, lakeshore, the stuff that we chose that we wanted back.
So I've been with the Forest Service for 2 years, and was incredibly happy to join the Forest Service and begin working on this project, and kind of walked into a process that was already at least 5 years in the making, right? So a lot of this negotiation was done prior to my joining the Forest Service. However, I can say that the Forest Service, staff at the Forest Service, with the exchange and the conversation and the discussion about lands to be exchanged, were supportive. of the parcels chosen. And the band also received really strong support from Minnesota's congressional delegation. And so important and key, but incredibly helpful, right, to kind of our process of elimination. We have a small lands team with the Forest Service, with the Leech Lake Band, with BLM Bill Surveyor. And we've been meeting for the 2 years that I've been on the project frequently to kind of discuss, take another look. We had a big meeting at one of Leech Lake's facilities a couple of years ago, and just said, okay, here we are. We got it all narrowed down. We have our target acreage, and spent the day really looking at each and every parcel and just making sure, do we want this? Yes. Do we want this? And it was just, I think, incredibly rewarding for all parties, but also our communication throughout this project, very close communication throughout the project, has caused it to move along relatively quickly, right? And I'll get into, maybe it's a good time to talk about it now. Some of the parcels chosen, as Matt said earlier, are lakeshore. And some of them, much of the lakeshore that the band chose, has Forest Service improvements, recreational residences, so summer homes, cabins, recreational facilities. And the act explicitly prohibits transfer of those parcels. However, the forest and our region, our interpretation, and what we support is we can partition those lands so that we can take out the land that those recreational residences or other improvements are situated upon, and retain that and transfer the remainder, which sounds like less, but in all cases, it is the larger part of the parcel, right, to the band. Because it's federal land, and in, I think, almost all cases, we have 11 parcels that needed to be surveyed. The surveyor is the BLM's, Bill's, and cadastral survey team. And the price for that is just a little south of $500,000. Forest Service is funding the cost of those surveys. And I referred to the 96% of legal descriptions complete. The remainder are the legal descriptions for those partition parcels.
And then I kind of wanted, excuse me, wanted to go back and, we kind of made it sound like the staff was the only one picking these lands, and we do know the lands very well as we're out there on them all the time. But we did solicit feedback from the community. We couldn't go public with this at the time, but we have things called local Indian councils for each community. We had all of them come to us and give us any feedback, showed them maps of what we had chosen, tribal council as well, and our natural resource advisory committee. Everybody had feedback, which was good for us. We did make some changes after getting some of that feedback from our members, because that's who we do work for, is the tribal members. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that. And then, you know, one of the bigger wants and needs from everyone around is that cultural access. And I can't do a presentation without mentioning our wild rice at Leech Lake. We certainly picked parcels to where we thought would help us better access the wild rice there on Leech Lake.
I don't see Chairwoman Shavers in the room, so Matt, would you say that Leech Lake rice is the best wild rice?
Yeah, she claimed that Boise Fort rice was the best, but we're the self-proclaimed ricing capital of the world, so I kind of had to differ from her choice.
So it brings up a really good point. Matt talked about going to their local Indian councils, and there are 13 total on the Leech Lake Reservation. But very importantly, all of our work on the Forest Service end, right? Because we're the agency that is tasked with delivering this. We have to answer to Congress. But, you know, our process in Forest Service is we also have to put it on our schedule of proposed actions. It's called the SOPA, and consult with the public. Everything that we've done, we have not done scoping yet with the public, not formal scoping. All of our actions are pre-decisional and in consultation, sometimes with a small c, sometimes with a big C, with the Leech Lake Band. So important to add, we, prior to our delivery to Congress of the final product, you know, we need to take that step of scoping with the public and receiving comments. I will say that we've gotten a lot of feedback thus far from the public about the transfer. It certainly has been in the news locally, and folks know about it, and it seems like, you know, whenever we take kind of another step, or I know that Minnesota Public Radio has run a couple of stories, and then my phone rings off the hook. Fine and happy to take those calls.
And, you know, with projects like these, as many of you, you know, it comes with hurdles when natives start getting land back. There's people who don't like that, you know, especially if it's close to their land. At the beginning of the conference, Pachanga's chairman told a story about when they were going to develop this casino. The realtor was telling the landowners just adjacent to this property, because they had concern, and they said, "Don't worry, there's never going to be anything there." Well, what are you really saying? That, you know, who's not going to be there? And so we've come across a few instances that, like Christine said, this came out formally, but the map hasn't come out publicly, and that's for a reason. We didn't want that pushback. But when we were ground truthing some of these lands to select them, Dave and I were out to a parcel, kind of just looking it over, and this is just an example. What a landowner just to the north had come out. He's being respectful, but he said he heard about it on the news, and, you know, come ask us what we're doing, and we told him we're just kind of looking at this land here. And like I said, he heard it on the news, and he said, well, is this going to be part of that project? And we said, we're not sure yet. And he mentions that, or he asks what we're going to do if we get that back, and we said, we're not sure yet. You know, we're being respectful, as we always are. And he said, well, I kind of like the forest the way it is. And it kind of made me laugh and think, my ancestors did too, you know? So just kind of wanted to bring that up. You know, as good as this partnership is, and as good as well as we've been working together, there is some pushback, and there will be some pushback, as always is in cases where Native Americans are getting land back.
So importantly, the Act talks about valid encumbrances on the land will remain and will be respected. And so when I've talked with folks who call me and ask me about the legislation, about what we're doing, I try to get to the heart of their concerns. And a common question is, well, I maybe am not going to be able to get to my house anymore, my recreational residence anymore. And if that's really the question, if that's really the concern, that's the concern you're expressing to me, right? That encumbrance, that road right away will remain. And the band, you know, will respect that if it's attached and if it's valid, first of all, and attached to the land. So I've had interesting conversations on the phone with concerned landowners. And as Matt said, they'll continue to come in, especially when we do the public scoping. We're very confident in the language of the Act and our actions, and feel that there aren't valid arguments. Folks, you know, can express their concerns, but boy, I tell you, on both sides, we've kind of, I think, envisioned any and every question that would come up and talk through it. So, high level of confidence. So just quickly, lands that the band looked at, right, are the parcels that were transferred by secretarial order, public domain lands that the Forest Service was kind of built on, and other land that the Forest Service acquired. And as the slide said, each kind of category of land has different records. So it was a deep dive into records, but very successful. I came from a system of records at the BIA, which I was very familiar with. Super happy to walk into the Forest Service and see that the Forest Service corporate records are comprehensive and complete and historical.
And so this kind of goes back to the selection process. You can kind of read through what went into our thoughts when we're making those. The limitations of Bill, like Christine said, we couldn't pick parcels that had those summer cabins or a campground. There's a lot of actually really nice campgrounds on the Chippewa National Forest.
Come visit.
Yeah, come visit sometime. It's real nice up there. So, you know, some of those, I mean, if we could, we did pick right around the summer recreational cabins. And that's where the surveying would come in to split that parcel a lot of it it's lakeshore, and that's what we were going after. It's a high value, not just economically speaking, but culturally speaking. You know, we did ground truth. It's funny, we were making these picks, choices, kind of on the computer using GIS and things like that. Some of the parcels that we kind of knew, like I said, you know, the land stewards, us at the Division of Resource Management, and we're having a meeting with our tribal council, and one of them asks, you know, well, did you guys go out there and check these lands? And we're like, not really. He's like, well, why not? Like, well, it's 11,760 acres. And so we're talking about, you know, he's like, well, you wouldn't buy a house without going looking at it first, right? Which is a good point. So we kind of went all hands on deck at the Division of Resource Management and recruited all we could, and kind of broke all these parcels down into zones, and used things like AGOL and to collect the data, take pictures of what's on the land. It's all forested, but still you could kind of get an idea of the terrain and the vegetation, things like that. And so we did that for a couple weeks, I think it was, which was pretty fun. We had a lot of people out checking all these lands, and we kind of developed a ranking system, high, medium, low priorities on these parcels as we're checking them. Let's see here. Some of the heritage sites that were known, we actually avoided picking those parcels because the Chippewa National Forest, I might mess this up, I don't know what act it was, where they have to protect the grave sites or heritage. What's that?
NAGPRA.
NAGPRA? Okay. So those will always be protected. And so we kind of took those parcels off, where initially we kind of thought, okay, we want those for those reasons, but those will always be protected and under the Chippewa National Forest. And then even looking back at the Chippewa National Forest's original idea, community proximity, you know, that wasn't a bad idea. We could, in the future, expand on some of those communities, make them larger. Let's see.
So it's kind of a checklist, right, of what the band considered, or at least a partial checklist. You know, how does this fit any of these priorities, or do we want to exclude a parcel for any of these reasons? And this slide is taken from a presentation that the band did with the local Indian community or councils. And, you know, just kind of their contemplation, talking to those representatives of the communities. And, you know, do we want to live here? Do we want to build here? Is the need now? Will it be a need in the future? And what do we want to exclude from residential or economic development? And why do we want to exclude those things?
And then one thing too is the third sentence down there, and that's why Rich was so important. Rich Robinson was so important. You know, he knew that this wasn't for him, it was for our future generations. And we know that right now because some of this land is very rural and forested, deep in the woods. We're not going to see development on it right away. It costs a lot to get electricity utilities out there. We're thinking down the road for generations to come. And that was a big consideration, you know, picking this land.
Important to add that, of course, if the band wants to leave it exactly as is, there isn't anything in the act or anything from the forest that says, no, you're getting this land, now do something with it. If the do something with it is we want to leave it just the way it is, that is the do something with it. So I talked earlier about the plan of survey and kind of, you know, what that really kind of body of work defined. And This is a summary. This is a chart that we incorporated into the plan of survey that just kind of talked about researching. Where are we getting our information? How are we verifying that information? Who is verifying that information? Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs is accepting these parcels. They involved the bills, the BLM's Indian land surveyor, to make sure that legal descriptions that the Forest Service is providing is sufficient for and accurate for when the BIA becomes the trustee of that land. It just kind of talks about the records that we researched, our verification, finding survey records if we needed to do that, and then how we are going to, and this is from the Forest Service perspective, but I think also the Leech Lake bands too, how we're going to store and retain that information. How do we, the Forest Service, ensure that we're keeping track of that title transfer? And we know that, hey, this is tribal trust land now. We need to remove that parcel from our corporate records. And then kind of moving into what looks kind of more like the end game, and that's verification with the bills surveyor, making sure that we have accurate legal descriptions, so that it's kind of a seamless transition when we deliver to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Land Titles and Records Office. Point number 4, we speculated that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would be responsible for surveying any parcels. No. Forest Service has taken that on, we want to ensure that we are delivering something that is accurate and complete. And so when that land goes into trust, if after that trust tract is kind of activated and in the system, that the band is free to begin with their plans for the land.
So here's the steps that we took during this process. And we kind of talked about it already, but we finalized and submitted that map of our choices to the Forest Service and BLM, reviewed it with the Forest Service, highlighting the recreation sites and archaeology sites, collect and verify the record documents, archive record documents, prepare DOI and LDRs, ensure legal descriptions meet legal requirements, and then I think this is where we're at now, at the 96%. We need to submit the final map to Congress to finalize the transfer. So we're pretty close to that point.
We're very close. The optimistic among us, it's me, would love to wrap up this 11,760 acres, which actually we have determined to be a little bit more than that. And the Forest Service is supportive of that, of more than 11,760 acres. The Act says approximately, right? So there's a little, that's a little broad. But yeah, so when we kind of wrap up the survey work, and Matt and Dave both were instrumental kind of in our initial attempts, or the BLM's initial attempts, to go out in the field and kind of try to determine these partition lines for these parcels. And so incredibly valuable, I think, and I should let them speak to this, but valuable for their work experience, valuable for our relationships, and really valuable when we go back to tribal leaders and talk to them about how we're looking at partitioning this land. And Dave and Matt both can, as tribal employees, speak to and explain, any kind of reason why, the line is here and not here. So, I don't know if you guys want to share any stories from the field, or it's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. I wanted to talk about why this partnership works, right, between the Chippewa National Forest and the Leech Lake Band. Oh, gosh, I've got too many jobs, guys. So, talking about why this partnership works. On both sides, there's acknowledgement, there is spoken, expressed acknowledgement of things that have happened, and conversations about what we can do, right, as co-stewards of this land, because that's really how we approach decisions, is as co-stewards. Chippewa National Forest was built right on top of the Leech Lake Reservation, and that's the fact, right? And so we're well aware of that on the forest. But we acknowledge the things that have happened, and acknowledge that we have a lot to learn from things that happened, both good and bad. We do have a genuine respect for one another. We communicate freely. We have monthly consultation meetings with the Leech Lake Band. We consult, the Forest Service consults with the band on, prior to any decision that we make within the reservation boundaries, but also within ceded territory. So, which, the forest is, exists on 1855 ceded territory. And so we include that in our consultation. We have tribal members that, tribal employees that are part of our project planning review teams. So, together we have specialists that work together and review projects before we even get it to a pre-decisional, just to identify any issues that might exist, any concerns, is there a better way? And all of this is kind of commemorated in a MOU between the band and the forest. So that really guides our actions. But what has been great for me to see, and the comments that I've heard at monthly meetings, is we've come so far. We sit down in a room for a meeting, and it used to be one side and one side. And now we're all sitting together. We share meals before our meetings. And staff on both sides kind of communicate very freely and discuss issues. So it's a successful relationship, and one that I am proud to work on and help build and help facilitate.
And then adding on to what Christine said, not to be a downer, but it wasn't always that way. A lot of the older employees tell me anyway that the Forest Service, just simply wouldn't work with the tribe, or would almost laugh at suggestions. So nowadays it's a lot different. When I grew up in Leech Lake and around the Chippewa National Forest. When I was a kid, the campgrounds and the trails and even the land, I did not think that was for us. Even though it's the Chippewa National Forest, it's supposed to be there for us. But that was not the thought with me or my community or my family. But nowadays, even when I started working for the tribe, for the government, I can see that relationship that Christine is talking about just get better year after year with these meetings, with the consultations. I'm involved in a lot of these, and it truly has come a long ways. It's took some time just to respect. I do feel like the CHIP is, we shorten it, call it the CHIP, is being a lot more respectful and understanding some of our core values a lot more, and hearing our voices in their decision making.
And cool thing that we're doing on the forest. We have a team, and we're working with Leech Lake Tribal College and Leech Lake employees, but we have a team that is working to find the history of places and include that history at our recreational sites, which seems like a no-brainer, right? Here, you're here, and this is what this was, and it's cool, and it's to be shared, and it's to be respected. But it's kind of one of those light bulb moments that that occurred, I don't know, within the last couple of years. Now we have a really kind of active team just reaching out to elders in the community and looking for those stories, and how do we add this, and how do we educate people. We do have a very, from the Forest Service perspective, and looking at it through the lens of wanting people to come and visit. And I really want you guys to come and visit because it's beautiful. But, it is a gorgeous place. It's a beautiful place, and there are stories there, and it's so unique, right? And we can really showcase it. And so I feel like we're moving in that direction, and I'm excited about it. Hearing the stories, a lot, or like Dave shared the story about an employee whose grandmother was born near a rising site. Those are the things that we're looking for and soliciting, and so they'll be posted and shared, and we'll continue to build on that.
So we got about 25 minutes left, and we're going to leave that for any questions or discussion that anyone had.
I have some comments. So my name is Cassandra Atencio, and I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer with the Southern Ute Indian Tribe in Ignacio, Colorado, with the Southern Ute Reservation. And I apprenticed under my late father starting in 2013. And I think it's very commendable what you're doing, and I encourage you. My one question, I have a few questions. Your last slide showed that you developed an MOU, and I'd like to know why you did an MOU and not an MOA, because as I understand it, an MOU is not legally binding, as merely a handshake. So I'd like to know, like, why you chose an MOU rather than an MOA. The second question is, if you go back a few of your slides, those things that you talked about, your landforms, your lake shores and things, those are also cultural resources. And as you think about cultural resources, they all actually intertwine together. And I think presenting that also, that's how they're connected to each other. So if you were to also add that into your plan on part of your slides about why those lake shores are the wild rice, that's a culturally important thing. I think rather than saying, the other thing was you talked about archaeological sites and burials in your one slide. I think if you also put in sites of cultural and religious significance, because that's most eligible sites that are important to a tribe are not eligible when you think about it in that fashion, but under the identification phase in the 106 process, it is that sites that are of cultural and religious significance to a tribe are also eligible sites. So you put that, import that also into that way, and that can be as broad or as narrow as you want it to be. So that's kind of my comments from looking at your slides about how you incorporate that. And rather than saying stories, you talk about oral history, because oral history is it connects it more and tells that story, because before things were written, they were orally passed down. That makes it also, when you look at that 106 process within the identification phase and within NEPA and all of those things, XOs, the executive orders about what sacred sites are. Sacred sites aren't just those places where ceremonies are had, but also where you gather before, during, and after. And I think I've said this numerous times. That means your plants. That means your wild rice. That means where your family goes to. And I think if you try to interconnect that more, it helps also up your report. And so I really commend you for doing that. I just seen some of those comments that I have. Thank you.
Yeah, McWitch, for those comments. Appreciate it. Appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. Regarding, and I'll speak to the MOU versus MOA. We're one of the first, right, between the forest and the Leech Lake Band. And I think that there was, honestly, I think that everybody wanted to say, hey, look, if this isn't working for us, or working for us exactly the way that we want it, we really want the right to kind of pull it back and have a redo, right? I'm speculating, because it was written before I joined the Forest Service. But I appreciate your point about an MOA versus an MOU. And when it comes time for us, both parties to look at our agreement or memorandum of understanding, that is something I believe that we'll consider. So, thank you.
I'd like to comment too on your, when you're talking about oral history versus storytelling. This wouldn't be happening right now if that oral history didn't exist and Rich didn't tell that, pass that down to us. So I appreciate that comment.
I just had a question. If you can talk a little bit more about how they came up with, the acreage number and all of that. How does it correlate with the number lost, or how did that work?
Sure. So the total acreage of the secretarial transfers, like I mentioned earlier, was just above 16,000. Almost 17,000 acres. But like I said, we, in this act, we're only working within the Cass County, and that number was 11,760. Yeah, I know I figured a question like that would come in, but so there's, I think, an additional, 4,000 some in Itasca, and then 1,000 plus in Beltrami. Yeah, that we're gonna hope to work on soon if we can get it into legislation.
So Cass County not only had the highest amount of acres transferred under the secretarial order, but the Leech Lake Band has worked hard on their relationship with the county as well. And that county was supportive of this transfer. We need to work a little bit more, I think, or we'll be optimistic about it because I'm the optimist, right? So maybe the other two counties, Beltrami and Itasca County, are waiting to see what happens with Cass County. So that's the optimistic slant. But again, like Matt said, in comparison, a smaller acreage spread across those two counties.
I was just curious that the secretarial transfers were on allotted lands, is that what primarily says? So the lands that are coming in, they won't be considered that, right? It's just going to be tribal trust?
Tribal trust. Yep. Yep. So they'll go from, federal land, trust land, under the jurisdiction of the USDA Forest Service to Leech Lake tribal trust land.
Yeah, and that question gets asked even locally to us quite a bit. There were allotments at one point. Are they going to come back as allotments? But they're not. They're going to come back to the band in trust.
Just out of curiosity, why wouldn't they come back to the heirs of the lawsuit? It seems that there's an original owner. Now, I stole it from them. That would come back, should be given back to them and their heirs. Why would the tribe not allow that to happen?
So,
I'm asking the tribe, not the government.
Well, as these were given out back in the allotment era, and as you know, the BIA tracks the original allotments. Once that ended, I believe that the tracking ends at that time. So I'm not sure why they made this deal that way, but I don't even think they have they would track the heirs to this point. And I'm not 100% sure why it was because it was written into law this way. And we agreed to that. So that's my best answer for you. Right. And I can give you a better answer too. Let's exchange information.
I was thinking, that on the same lines as you, why wouldn't we come back to the actual allottees of that land? I am on an allotment. I have a few allotments that were kind of handed down to me through people in my family tree. I try to do something with that property and trying to get 51% of consent from all the rest of my heirs on that property, and it is almost impossible to do that. And that was in the 80s. We're quite a few years past that now, and some of our lists of allottees now are in a book about this high. And it is hard to do anything with that. So I think they took that into consideration when they were, so should we give it back to these allottees, that it's going to be almost impossible to get consent to do anything with that property. I just wanted a little place to put my I had a trailer house at the time, and I couldn't do it. So I myself would like to have to be able to do something with this property instead of having it just sit and nothing, nothing happen to it, because it's so hard to do anything with it in the first place if you put it back into the allottees. But, I wasn't part of that. But that's just my own opinion.
I had a question about Forest Service permitted uses, and just if this is too early to ask this question, then fine, but wondering how you're going to go about eventually communicating to people that are cutting Christmas trees and using roads and stuff like that, that now it's different.
So that's a really good point. We publish annually, both available in printed form, but more commonly available electronically, maps, right, of areas where, here's where that kind of harvest by non-tribal members is permitted. So that's my best answer. The other thing is we have, I think, seen and found that on the Chippewa National Forest, the folks that go out and get a Christmas tree or, collect other small forest products, they're pretty in tune with what's going on. They are repeat customers, right? So they're watching and listening. Thank you. Great question.
Any more questions? All right, well, this is my first time being here. It's a beautiful land. I wanted to acknowledge the people here and the land and appreciate it for the hosting. Beautiful place here. And thank you, everybody, for listening to us. Miigwech.